palace didn't erupt in chaos when Nero began to lose power. It went quiet. Servants packed without asking. Advisors avoided eye contact. Conversations moved to other rooms. And Nero, pacing the halls at night, began to understand something terrifying. No one was afraid anymore. Stay and you'll discover how Rome prepared for life after Nero, how an emperor became unnecessary while still alive, and how his final days unfolded in isolation, denial, and fading echoes. Long before the world would remember Emperor Nero as a symbol of excess and spectacle, there was a quiet unraveling already in motion, one that unfolded not in roaring arenas or burning streets, but in whispered conversations, abandoned corridors, and a growing distance between a ruler and the reality he once commanded. And by the final years of his reign, the empire he believed revolved around his presence had begun to move without him, slowly, deliberately, as though preparing itself for a future where his voice no longer mattered, and Nero sensed this long before anyone dared say it aloud. For power has a way of announcing its departure subtly, through silence rather than rebellion, through hesitation rather than open defiance. And it was in these moments of silence that the emperor's confidence began to fracture, not suddenly, but in thin, spreading lines that no performance could conceal. Because Nero lived in a world where admiration was currency, where applause felt like loyalty, and where silence felt like betrayal. And when the applause softened, he did not see it as change, but as threat. And this misreading would define his final days more than any enemy ever could. Because while emperors were meant to command legions and shape history, Nero was obsessed with being seen, being heard, being remembered as extraordinary. And when the empire grew tired of watching, he found himself alone with a crown that no longer protected him from the most dangerous thing imaginable to a ruler, irrelevance. And as senators grew cautious, generals distant, and messengers slower to arrive, Nero retreated into a carefully curated illusion of control, surrounding himself with courtiers who praised his every word and artists who clapped on command, creating a world where truth was filtered through flattery. And in this artificial environment, the emperor mistook noise for stability, believing that as long as voices praised him, authority remained intact. And yet beyond the palace walls, the tone had shifted. For Rome was weary, its patience thinned by years of instability, and whispers of dissatisfaction drifted through forums and villas alike, carried not by rebels but by resignation. And resignation is far more dangerous than anger because it signals a quiet decision to move on. And Nero, sensitive to atmosphere yet blind to cause, responded by withdrawing further into performance. Staging displays meant to reclaim attention rather than address unrest, and this only widened the distance between ruler and ruled, until the empire felt less like a domain and more like an audience waiting for the curtain to fall. And as the days passed, Nero's nights grew restless, filled with pacing through halls that once echoed with confidence, but now returned his footsteps hollow and distorted. And in these echoes he heard what no advisor would say aloud, that the empire no longer feared him, and fear once lost rarely returns, and the emperor's response was not preparation but denial, convincing himself that loyalty could be summoned through presence alone, that if he appeared, spoke, performed, the world would remember why it needed him. And yet each attempt felt more desperate than the last, as though he were chasing a version of himself that no longer existed. And the most unsettling part of Nero's decline was not the loss of allies, but the loss of awareness, for he continued to believe he was central, even as the machinery of power quietly adjusted around him. Senators discussing succession without his name, commanders hesitating before responding to his orders, servants watching him with something closer to pity than reverence, and these subtle shifts gnawed at him. Feeding a growing anxiety he masked with spectacle and indulgence, because indulgence offered temporary relief from the creeping realization that the world was preparing for his absence. And in this fragile state, Nero began to misinterpret every delay as conspiracy, every silence as betrayal, and every neutral expression as judgment, isolating himself further by demanding reassurance from those who had already begun to detach emotionally. And the palace, once alive with intrigue and influence, grew strangely quiet. Not because activity had ceased, but because conversations moved elsewhere, into villas, camps, and council rooms, where Nero's presence was no longer required, and this quiet was devastating to an emperor who thrived on attention, because it stripped him of the very thing he believed defined his greatness. And as his authority thinned, his fear thickened, creating a tension that followed him everywhere, from banquet halls to private chambers, from public appearances to solitary walks through gardens that felt suddenly unfamiliar, and in these moments Nero clung to memory, replaying past triumphs, standing before mirrors, rehearsing expressions of command, trying to convince himself that the image he saw still matched the reality beyond the glass. And yet each reflection felt slightly delayed, slightly disconnected, as though even his own image no longer aligned with who he believed himself to be. And the Empire, sensing this misalignment, responded not with confrontation but with quiet adjustment, preparing for continuity without spectacle. For Rome had learned long ago that emperors came and went, but survival depended on adaptation, not loyalty to personality. And this realization marked the beginning of Nero's most tragic descent, because he was not undone by a single moment, nor by a dramatic act of defiance, but by the slow erosion of relevance, the subtle withdrawal of belief, and the unbearable awareness that his greatest fear was coming true. Not that he would be defeated, but that he would be forgotten. And as this awareness settled in, the final phase of his life began to take shape, one defined not by grandeur, but by retreat, not by command, but by avoidance, and not by power, but by a growing sense that the empire had already moved on, leaving its emperor behind with nothing but echoes, illusions, and the crushing realization that a crown means nothing when no one is listening anymore. As the emperor's isolation deepened, the world beyond his carefully arranged performances began to move with a quiet determination that no longer included him, and while Nero still believed Rome waited for his next appearance, decisions of consequence were now being made in rooms where his name was mentioned less and less, spoken not with fear or admiration, but with weary practicality, as if discussing a problem already halfway solved. And this shift unsettled him in ways no public criticism ever could, because it denied him the role he believed he was born to play. And so he responded in the only way he knew how, by clinging tighter to the illusion that presence alone could restore control, filling his days with rehearsed displays and his nights with restless wandering, hoping that movement might drown out the silence gathering around him. And yet the silence only grew heavier, pressing in through the palace corridors like a fog that refused to lift, and those closest to him noticed the change first, observing how his conversations circled endlessly around himself, how he demanded reassurance not of the empire's stability, but of his own importance, and how even praise no longer seemed to satisfy him, because deep down he sensed it was no longer sincere, and sincerity, once lost, cannot be commanded back into existence. And as Nero's confidence eroded, his judgment followed, leading him to withdraw from the very structures that might have anchored his authority, leaving administrative duties to others while he focused on maintaining the image he believed history would remember, unaware that history had already begun to rewrite its narrative without him. And in this withdrawal he made a fatal miscalculation, mistaking absence for mystique, believing that distance would renew anticipation, when in reality it only accelerated detachment, allowing Rome to adjust smoothly to the idea of a future without his voice. And as that future took shape, messengers brought news that unsettled him profoundly, not because it spoke of open revolt, but because it revealed indifference, reports delivered without urgency, updates framed as routine rather than crisis, signaling that the machinery of the empire no longer revolved around his immediate reaction. And this realization struck harder than any threat could have, because it revealed a truth Nero could not perform his way out of, that authority depends not on self-perception, but on collective belief, and belief was slipping away quietly, steadily. Beyond his reach, and in response, Nero retreated further into a shrinking circle of trust, surrounding himself with a handful of attendants whose loyalty was sustained by habit rather than conviction. And within this narrowed world, his thoughts turned increasingly inward, replaying moments from his reign, not to learn from them, but to reassure himself that he had once mattered. And this inward turn created a dangerous echo chamber, where doubt amplified itself and fear dressed itself as insight, convincing him that the threat he faced was not political, but personal, not structural, but conspiratorial. And this belief drove him to seek escape rather than engagement, to imagine retreat as strategy, withdrawal as wisdom, and distance as protection. And it was in this state of mind that Nero began preparing for departure. Not as an emperor relocating authority, but as a performer leaving a stage he believed had become hostile, choosing isolation over confrontation because isolation felt controllable. And as plans quietly formed, the palace took on a different atmosphere, one of waiting rather than anticipation. As servants packed discreetly, advisors avoided direct questions, and the usual rhythms of court life slowed to a cautious stillness. And Nero, sensing the shift but misreading its meaning, interpreted the quiet as proof that his presence was still powerful enough to command restraint, when in reality it reflected a collective decision to allow events to unfold without interference. And as the moment of departure approached, the emperor's thoughts grew increasingly disordered, swinging between confidence and despair, between grand visions of return and gnawing fear that no return awaited him. And this emotional instability manifested in small, telling ways: the way he hesitated before giving orders, the way he listened too closely for approval, the way he lingered on words spoken casually, searching for hidden meanings that confirmed his fears. And through it all, the empire continued its quiet transition, senators aligning themselves with continuity, officials preparing for change, and the city itself carrying on with daily life, shops opening, conversations flowing, routines maintained, all without reference to the man who once believed he embodied Rome itself. And this ordinary persistence was perhaps the most devastating blow of all, because it revealed that the world Nero feared losing had already learned how to exist without him. And as he prepared to leave the palace that had both elevated and sheltered him, he did so not as a commanding figure directing events, but as a man attempting to outrun a realization he could no longer suppress, that his power had dissolved not in fire or fury, but in quiet adjustment. And this quiet, unremarkable transition set the stage for what would follow. A final chapter defined not by resistance or redemption, but by the slow stripping away of illusion. As Nero moved further from the center of power and closer to the uncomfortable truth that the empire he tried so desperately to impress had already turned its attention elsewhere, leaving him to face the consequences of a life built on applause once the audience had gone silent.